let's start again. Today we're going to take up a really interesting topic, nominally entitled Spiritual Beliefs and the Brain. Our goal is lofty. We're trying to figure out what's real and how do we know it's real. We'll do this in 4 parts. First, we're going to talk about the idea of transcendence and how that relates to the brain, at least to the best of our current understanding. Then we're going to do some workhorse kind of work. We're going to look at several different kinds of brain scans because several will be relevant to the discussion of how we perceive reality and how we can measure that using these different kinds of brain scans. So we'll have a brief discussion of those several different types. Then we'll go on to engage the experiments conducted by Dr. Andy Newberg, who's written widely on the issue of spirituality and its measurement in the brain using those aforementioned brain scans. And lastly, we'll take a stab at trying to put together a coherent narrative about how the brain takes all this information and tries to assemble some sort of reality from these disparate sources and inputs, at least to the best of our current technical ability. As you'll see, there's a whole bunch we don't know, but we're trying. So we get credit for that, right? Let's get started. We know that human beings can get into what we'll call an altered state of consciousness. We've had many reports of this over the millennia by people that would be identified as mystics or religious folks who are deeply interested in spirituality. Could be saints. Other people have reported the same thing, as we talked about when we discussed animals entering mystical states. Obviously, we wouldn't call it mystical for animals, but some sort of transcendent state where they're not responsive to normal stimuli as they would be under most circumstances. Humans can do this voluntarily at will and through a variety of mechanisms, which we've also discussed. So the first point I want to make is that we're not talking necessarily about something highly fantastic. These are states of consciousness that are enterable through the mechanisms that we've already discussed, and they shouldn't be confused with some sort of pathology in the brain or the misfiring of neurons. They're not that. There's something else. So today we're going to try to figure out what that something else might entail. We know that neurobiologically we can demonstrate specific and repeatable kinds of changes during things like meditation and prayer. And these changes basically disrupt the normal processes that go on in the brain. And the brain achieves a different reality. It perceives the status quo differently. We also know that this perception can be liberally changed, modified by emotional states, and also simple linguistic modifications. Just to get straight to the point, people who engage in practices that we would call transcendence via whatever mechanism they choose often identify that state as having achieved a state of awe, a state of unification with the great beyond, and hyper-real, real in a sense that isn't communicable by our normal everyday life kinds of perceptive capacities. And we saw this when we looked at the physician who nearly died due to meningitis and entered this other realm, which he called a hyper-real environment. So this sensation of transcendence may or may not be religious-based, but it is certainly compatible with religious ideas and the the hope of entering the realm of the divine, however you understand that. We'll be talking about Andy Newberg, Dr. Andy Newberg, who has been at a couple of different institutions. I'm not sure where he is right now. He was in Pittsburgh for a while, and I think he's gone elsewhere since then. He has a colleague, Eugene D'Achille, with whom he did a lot of these early studies. His goal was to look at two populations of individuals, Buddhist monks and Catholic nuns, doing their thing, whatever it is, that connects them to the God of their understanding. So in the case of the Buddhist monks, it was meditation with a focus on a sacred image, and in the case of the Catholic nuns, they used a specific prayer to get into this transcendent state. So what Newberg and D'Achille did was to look at specific changes in the brain taking place during these two events, prayer or meditation. They realized that both practices have the ability to reduce the mundane obstacles present in the real world that prevent us from having this transcendent state. It also demonstrably increases the ability to listen and perhaps receptivity to that other world, however you understand it. Importantly, all of the subjects that he used, or they used, had a minimum of 15 years of experience in prayer or meditation. So these were not novices, they were not newbies, they had extensive experiences in these practices. They could reliably conjure them up internally, and so they seemed like stable, legitimate people who would be good sources of experimentation for Newberg and D'Achille. Also, they specified that they would not choose individuals who were using psychotropic drugs to enter these states. They wanted a natural way of accessing this world. This is a copy of the prayer that the nuns were using to enter the transcendent state. It's a prayer from the Catholic text of the Cloud of Unknowing. It goes like this: and therefore it is to pray in the height and the deepness, the length and the breadth of our spirit, and that it not in many words, but in a little word of one syllable. And what shall this word be? Let us therefore, when we intentively pray for the removal of evil, say or think or mean naught else, nor know more words, but this little word, sin. And if we intentively pray for the getting of good, let us cry, either with the word, or with thought, or with desire, naught else, no more words, but this word, God. Fill thy spirit with the ghostly bemeaning of it, without any special beholding to any of his works, whether they be good, better, or best of all. So the idea here is to kind of use this prayer to focus on a couple of words: sin in the case of bad things, and God in the case of good things, and use that to enter this transcendent state. In the sense that they're filtering the words in the prayer down to these two words, they're sort of using the words as a mantra. And as they were doing this, as they were praying this prayer, which incidentally had an awful lot of double negatives in it, so you would be forgiven if you didn't immediately grasp its meaning, but if you go back and read it a couple of times and adjust for the double negatives and the language, which is probably out of the King James version of things, then you'll be able to understand it. I have every confidence. So, before doing the experiments, Newberg asked both the nuns and the Buddhists, well, what would it mean to you if we take these pictures of your brains while you're doing this, and it confounds or it contradicts your belief in God? Well, the nuns said it didn't matter what the findings were. They were going to stick with their belief. The Buddhists, on the other hand, said if the brain scan somehow invalidated the nature of their religious understanding, they would have to change their beliefs. So there's an interesting differential there in the perspective of the two faiths and the two groups. Okay, so next I want to take a couple of minutes to briefly introduce the kinds of brain scans that you might see referenced in a variety of studies on transcendence. I don't want to get too heavily into the physics because heaven knows I am not competent to do that, but I can describe to you in general terms how they work and what they're measuring so that you get a better idea of how these things might be employed. So we'll talk briefly about fMRI, which stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging. It used to be called NMR, Nuclear Magnetic Resonance, but people got freaked out by the word nuclear, so they dropped that and changed to fMRI. We'll talk about PET scans, CT scans, and SPECT scans in the course of this discussion. They're important, and we need to understand the differences because they operate differently and they measure different things. So you would not want to use one where another was superior in its technical offerings. Let's start with fMRIs, again standing for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging. The basic mechanism of this technology is to use very powerful magnets to create a magnetic field, and that then is interfaced with radio frequency pulses, and lastly, a computer to produce a compilation of images which the computer combines into an image that you would understand as whole. You can, using this technology non-invasively, which is to say without going into the body with needles and probes and stuff like that, you can use it to create a visual image of the internal organs as well as soft tissue and bone. So it's a really powerful technology for getting a picture of what's going on in the body without disrupting that body. It is the sort of thing, however, if you get one of these scans, I've had many, you need to take off all your metal. And if you have, metal in your body somewhere as a result of surgery, you could be in trouble. Some of the bigger magnets, like the 4 Tesla magnets, are really incredibly powerful. And if you have any metal on you at all, you'll be sucked over to the magnet because they are so strong. The last one I had, my wedding ring, which is gold, of course, was vibrating, and it really freaked me out because one of the reactions of metal to the fMRI is to heat up to a very high temperature, and I was terrified that my ring was going to burn through my finger. Nothing happened, but it was a really scary thing, and just an indication of how powerful these magnets are. So a little bit more on how the fMRI works. One of the nice things about it is that it does not depend on ionizing radiation like an X-ray. You know that if you go to the dentist and have an X-ray done on your mouth, they're going to put you into a chair and put a lead vest over the rest of your body so it doesn't receive any of the X-ray ionizing radiation. It can be very bad for you. It can cause cellular disruption that can lead to cancer, so you really want to minimize your exposure to it, and that's why they use the lead aprons. But MRI doesn't have this. It doesn't use ionizing radiation, so it's much safer. Instead, what it does is to, while you're in the magnet, and you have radio waves in the magnet as well, it redirects the axes of the protons in those radio waves so that it creates a strong magnetic field. And then a current is passed through that field through wire coils, and the coils can be placed around the part of the body that you want to image, and using that mechanism can send and receive radio waves, which produces signals detected by the coils and end up making the image. But the interesting part to me about this technology is that the computer is absolutely necessary for this, because what the rest of the technical stuff is doing is creating a series of pictures, each at a slightly different level of the organ. Let's assume it's an organ being imaged. And so what the computer does is take all of these images that reflect very thin slices of the organ, and it puts those images together into a coherent whole so that the diagnostician can look at the organ at any level within the organ, or shift it around and visualize it from different angles. It's really, really a powerful technology. You can also use what they call contrast dyes. They might set you up with an IV in your vein, and at some point in the imaging, they might add a dye to the IV unit, which would course through your blood, and these dyes can be used to enhance the images and give them a color-coded aspect that can be helpful in diagnosis. Moving on, we have CT scans, or computerized tomography. These scans do require X-rays. The scan consists of a series of X-rays from which, using a computer, you can compile the images, and the structure of whatever you're imaging can be deduced and also analyzed from multiple angles. This technology is pretty old comparatively. It originally came out in 1971, and the prototype machine at the time took 160 parallel readings through 180 angles, each set 1 degree apart. The interesting thing, or the horrifying thing, is that each of those images, each of those 160 images, could take a little over 5 minutes to process. So an image from these scans could take as much as 2.5 hours to be processed by algebraic reconstruction techniques, which were the state of the art at the time, but fortunately with much, much faster computers, no longer take 2.5 hours. Thank goodness. A third technology are PET scans, PET scans. PET stands for positron emission tomography. A positron has a positive charge, but the mass of an electron. So it's kind of like a positively charged electron, and because it has the same mass as an electron, it's virtually massless. It's so teeny tiny that for all intents and purposes we can neglect its mass, particularly in comparison to larger fundamental particles like protons and neutrons. To do this, the patient will swallow a radioactive dye that will accumulate in different parts of the body, hopefully the body part you want to study, and it will give off gamma rays, which is fairly high level of ionizing radiation, but this will be detected by the scanner. And this kind of technology is very useful in measuring body functions like blood flow or metabolism of things that in the course of doing the metabolism might produce a colorimetric substance that can be detected and also quantified. So this is a nice technology in that it allows you to study not just the structure of an organ. In fact, you probably wouldn't choose this just to look at the structure of an organ, but you can look at the internal processes and determine whether the organ is healthy by looking at some of these different functions like blood flow and glucose metabolism. And that is usually measured through some sort of colorimetric reagent, as I just mentioned. But Newberg has done most of his work using a fourth kind of technology called the SPECT scan. SPECT stands for Single Photon Emission Computer Tomography. A photon is positively charged, has the mass of a proton. It can be both a wave and a particle. Hey, let's get confusing, but don't worry about it too much. I just wanted to give you the name so you know what it is, and also that it's different from the other kinds. So to do this kind of scan, one normally gets injected with a radioactive dye. And one of the really good things this technology can do is to measure blood flow in different parts of the brain. And it gives us an image that results from the differential blood flow in those different parts of the brain, and we can interpret it as follows. A red color means very high activity. A dark color, like blue or green, means relatively low activity. So this gives us a measurement which is not terribly invasive, from which we can deduce how how the organ is functioning as a result of the differential blood flow. So let's talk specifically about the Newberg-D'Achille experiments. And I want you to listen closely because I'm going to ask you to think about maybe some of the limitations of the experiments as they were conducted. So in a typical experiment, sometime before the prayer or the meditation began, Newberg would put an IV into the arm of the subject. He would then ask them to begin the prayer or meditation sitting in a chair and would at that point inject the radioactive dye into the arm of the subject. And the function of that is for the tracer to travel to the brain, where the brain will begin to metabolize the tracer according to the amount of blood flow in that area of the brain and create the relevant color that characterizes that level of blood flow. Now, these scans, the brain scans, the SPECT scans, were taken twice for each subject. During the first scan, the subject was asked to sit quietly and not think about anything. Try that. Try not thinking about anything. Lots of thoughts will immediately hop into your brain. That's just the way we're made. But these people were pretty experienced at blocking out all of the extraneous noise, so they probably could come pretty close to not thinking about anything. And as a result, Newberg was able to get what he called the baseline scan, which is to say activity levels when the subject's brain was at rest, not doing anything, at least consciously. So then they would take another scan, and the baseline scans, they would take another scan when the subject was engaged either in prayer or meditation, and they would compare the baseline scan to the second scan in which they were actively praying or meditating. And so what they were then doing is looking for differences between those two scans in terms of the blood flow in the brain as indicated by the color of the metabolic tracer in the brain. For the scans, the nuns started to pray about 10 minutes after they had gotten the radioactive dye started coursing through their brain. And then the nuns were taken out of their chair and physically transferred to the scanner. So then the difference between those two scans, one of which was taking place seated in a chair, during which time they were told to think of nothing, and the second of which took place after the dye had been circulating in their bloodstream. They were then asked to physically stand up and walk over to the scanner, lie down in the scanner, and that became the second scan. The difference between those two scans was the estimate of what the brain was doing in the prayer or the meditation. So here are two scans. On the left, we see the baseline scan for nuns, and on the right, we see the prayer scan for a nun in prayer. And they may look virtually the same to you, and you would be forgiven for that because, alas, it's difficult to make a lot of distinction on a color brain scan, which is not in color, it's in black and white. But let me draw a couple of things to your attention. This area up here is the frontal lobe where your forehead is and where your cognitive functions reside. And the arrow is pointing to the frontal lobe, and what you'll see is relatively high activity in the frontal lobe in the prayer scan in contrast to relatively low activity in the frontal lobe in the baseline scan. There's a similar difference in the so-called language center, which is in the temporal lobe. In the prayer scan, it's pretty highly colored with red. In the baseline scan, it's much less red. So to summarize, in the prayer scan of the nuns, there was increased activity in both the frontal lobe and the language center and the temporal lobe. So, how can we explain this? Well, we did see big differences in the resting state during which the baseline scan was taken and the active prayer scan. We saw red activity or high levels of activity both in the frontal lobe and the language center. And if we contrast that with what they found for the meditators, they were similar in the sense that in the meditators, he also found enhanced activity in the frontal lobe. But it was different in the sense that in the meditators, the language center was not heavily involved. And he explained that because the nuns, as you recall, were using that fairly lengthy prayer, focusing in on 2 words, but nonetheless using the whole prayer as their entree to the spirit world, whereas the meditators, or the Buddhist monks, were using a single word or mantra. So because the nuns were using more words, that is probably why the activity in the language center was enhanced in the nuns in prayer. But there was another interesting thing seen in both groups, but particularly and most reliably with the monks in meditation. And that was something taking place in the orientation center. Again, it's really hard to see. But I will tell you, and you can sort of see it here, you can see these dark black dots, which in fact are red. So there's high activity in the orientation center in the monks at rest. But there's much lower activity, indicated by a darker color, bluish and green, in the orientation area, in the monks who are involved in meditation. And it also was the case for the nuns, so this is why you see the prayer designation there. So this is kind of a strange finding. During both prayer and meditation, although more so in the case of the monks in meditation, there was lower activity in the orientation area. And the monks describe this as a state in which they were entering that space that we would call mysticism, a timeless dimension, perhaps a definition of the thing that we call transcendence. They said that it was that point where they begin to feel a distorted body images and a loss of a connection to time and to space. So we know that the orientation area is very involved in the interpretation of sensory information that helps us create a 3D understanding of the world and where we exist in it. Without this activity in the orientation center, we don't have a good understanding of where our body exists and where other things begin. Where do we stop? Where do other things begin? We lose that perception. So in that state, that's the time that the meditators felt that they were at one with the universe, that they had achieved, they'd escaped the bonds of earth, that they had gone into this other space. And since both the prayer induction and the meditators felt this, it looks as if the brain can experience those altered states, which may be based in low activity in the orientation center as transcendence. So Newberg tried to put this together and, from a brain science point of view, explain in more detail what was going on. He noted that the thalamus, we've talked about the thalamus before, regulates the flow of sensory information to many parts of the brain, including those that are responsible for higher cognitive properties, like the prefrontal cortex. Now, here's the interesting thing with respect to the scans. Normally, we expect to see simultaneous increases in thalamus activity, and that would be connected to parallel increases in the parietal lobes, or the orientation center, when the person is awake. And that's because we're out there busy trying to work our way through the world. We need to walk around. We need to drive. We have to have a pretty good idea of where our body fits into that physical context. But in both the nuns and the meditators, that activity in the parietal lobe decreased, as we've already discussed, but the thalamus remained at its normal wakeful activity. So there was a separation between what the thalamus was doing and what the prefrontal cortex was doing, and that's weird. That's hard to explain. But we know that this disparity in what was going on in the thalamus, and consequently the prefrontal cortex and the orientation center, seems to have created that altered perception of the world that we're calling transcendence. And it also is a case that the thoughts of the individuals were still lucid. The cognitive function didn't get weirded out by this disparity in what the thalamus was doing with respect to the orientation center. It was also interesting in the sense that the nuns and the monks had somewhat different interpretations of what was going on, and it was clearly filtered through their respective belief systems. The nuns felt that they were in the presence of God. The meditators, on the other hand, felt that they had achieved absolute consciousness with no deity figure involved. So again, you can see the influence of the training and traditions of the two types of individuals doing this. Now, Newberg will argue strongly that we're not just creating a reality that has physical components. He argues that there is also an emotional reality that comes together in these studies. In other words, our thoughts can create a sense of reality through the regulation of our emotional responses to things. So if you're pleasantly minded or you have an optimistic worldview, that can trigger relaxation through the release of dopamine in your system. On the other hand, if you're a bit anxious, you can't get your bills paid, you're late for school, you are worried about the world as we know it, anxious thoughts can cause the release of stress hormones like corticosteroids, and in extreme levels can evoke fight or flight responses. So it doesn't necessarily matter if your anxious thoughts are based on external reality. If you feel it, the hormones get released, and therefore it becomes your reality, even if the physical world doesn't provide you with affirmation. So in this sense, emotions influence our perception of the world. And it has some practical implications. If you're an anxious person and you maybe engage in meditation or some sort of prayer, it could trigger the release of dopamine and result in your relaxation. This is one of the ideas behind folks who recommend meditation as a way of dealing with the stress of the world, and studies have shown that, in fact, it can have precisely this effect. They've done brain studies on people practicing yoga and have found as much as a 65% increase in the dopamine release. So it seems to be a legitimate and verifiable phenomenon. There is some suggestion that different kinds of meditation may have different effects, and that's probably true. But there probably is one that's right for you as an individual. We don't have brain scans in great numbers, so we're still trying to figure out exactly how much therapeutic value can be derived from meditation or prayer. But we do think, using brain scans and the available evidence, that the various practices have one thing in common, namely, they have the ability to change the way we perceive reality. We're not changing actual reality, we're changing the way we perceive it. And that meditation practices, prayer, etc., can alter the autonomic nervous systems in healthy ways. So there are a whole bunch of things that need to come together to create our perception of the world. Some of it comes from our brain. Some of it comes from physical reality. Some of it comes from our perception of that reality layered in with our emotional state. So we know that a strong emotional response to anything, which is mediated by the amygdala, can enhance the realness of an event. Maybe you've had this happen. You have, for instance, a minor traffic accident, but if you're already in an anxious state when you have that accident, the fact that you are now in this emotional zone means that a minor accident can seem catastrophic to you at that moment. What if you're late for a job interview, or what if you have points on your license and this will get your license pulled? I mean, these are the sorts of things that might make a trivial non-injury accident seem like a really big deal. In a similar way, minor depression can make a small setback seem pretty hopeless. So your emotional state, which is responding to your internal biochemical state, makes the thing that just happened seem a lot worse than it actually is. We know that when meditators focus on a specific belief, the amygdala does get involved. It tells us that something is important, and that fact then signals the autonomic nervous system to kick in, and the thalamus makes it feel real. And this information is then fed back into the frontal lobes, where it's consciously recognized, and here's the interesting thing, it's then, this perception is filtered through your existing belief system. So we have an emotion and an event and some coloring from your internal belief system that all get together and conspire to create this sense of reality, which then the hippocampus will record in your memory. And the stronger the emotional content of this perception, the stronger the memory will be and the more persistent it will become. So what this slide is hoping to summarize is the fact that even if we simply focus on blood flow in the brain as a way of trying to approximate what the brain is thinking, it doesn't stand alone. There are many other layers of embellishment that go on within the brain, from memory, from emotion, etc., that alter the perception of that event. So we really have this incredibly complicated system. It's very difficult to parse out the individual effects and attribute them to individual parts of the brain. But what we can say is that sometimes reality is the result of a bottom-up process in which sensory information enters the body, is channeled through many different perceptual and cognitive algorithms in different parts of the brain, resulting in some sort of internal reality being established. But when that reality is channeled to the frontal lobes, a different reality may be the perception, and that reality may be divorced from sensory input. So the ultimate version of reality may differ from the sensory information that created it in the first place, because all of this other internal stuff gets layered on to modify the ultimate version of reality that we understand as being reality. The other way that we can perceive things in the real world is through a top-down process, or a top-down reconsideration or recontextualization of what the bottom-up process has created for us. The fMRI studies that we've been talking about suggest that our prefrontal cortex is the central repository for our working memory, and this is a basic understanding of neurobiology at this point. The prefrontal cortex has the ability to bring a momentary spark of recognition to whatever memories and facts are boiling up in your consciousness as constituting reality. And once this recognition is sparked, a cascade of additional neurological activity takes place to revise that perception of reality with input from the things that we've been talking about, like the orientation center, like the amygdala. So all of these things come together, and all told, although we have a lot of holes in the narrative here, it helps to understand the power of prayer and meditation, because it helps to identify which brain parts are contributing what aspects to what we ultimately call reality. And you can try simple experiments at home which may bring this to light to you in a fairly vivid way. If you sit down in a chair somewhere, maybe shut off the TV, drop the Nintendo, just sit there and think to yourself, the world is filled with loving people, and repeat that phrase 50 times. Afterwards, people have done this, and they've done controlled studies on this. Afterwards, people feel better. They feel happier. They feel like the world's a better place. So this simple exercise and the internalization of the idea that the world is a happy place with loving people can cause a measurable shift in one's mood. And then you can try the companion experiment if you repeat the phrase, the world is filled with mean, arrogant, selfish, ugly people who are stupid, or words to that effect. If you do that 50 times, you might lose that positive sense and feel irritated and anxious and emotionally distraught. And there's an important message here, and that is that we have a tendency to learn that which we live. So if you're surrounded by people with positive mindsets, who are simply helpful and happy and generally upbeat and positive, that will help create a more positive interpretation of events when they occur. And certainly one of the benefits of religion and religious rituals is to guide you to those positive feelings and create within you a sense of safety and well-being. We know that this is probably a dopamine release internally that causes the sense of well-being. And do we care where it comes from? Not particularly. It's a good thing to have. But this is something that can demonstrably lead to a sense of reality. And the truth is registered in your frontal lobes and may be contextualized through your religious beliefs. It's also a very good reason why we want to raise children in a positive, happy, supportive, loving environment, because their little brains are going through this at warp speed, and they're taking all this in, and they're forging their worldview every day. Now, it's important to realize that the actual physical reality of the world, including all the bad things that happen, hasn't changed. But, as the prophets like to say, none of us is capable of having a better past. The only real option we have going forward is to change not the situation. Well, we can try to change the situation, but it tends to be resistant to change, and that may not be possible. But we are in control of how we view a situation. and readjusting our thought processes through prayer, through meditation, through whatever floats your boat, can be demonstrably beneficial. Now, I wanted to end this presentation by asking you to critique the Newberg experiments. I talked about some of the technical details with the goal that we would get to this point and ask you to identify some strengths and some weaknesses. You might want to consider about what controls the investigators used in setting up the experiment. What are the sources of confounding information, or perhaps maybe some uncontrolled variables in the way they ran the experiments? And can you imagine any alternative interpretations of the data? So some of those questions might appear on an upcoming quiz. I'm just saying. And here's your study guide for spiritual beliefs in the brain.